bringing attention to the destruction of the 3 World Trade Center towers in New York City on September 11th, 2001, and a whole lot more. This is 9/11 Free Fall. Hi everyone, this is Andy Steele. Thanks for tuning in. John O'Malley is the guest today. He's a former government worker. He worked at the Pentagon, among other agencies. Well, he's awakened to the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence, and he's a volunteer with AE 9/11 Truth now. And he's a very cool and interesting guy to listen to. I know that every time I talk to him, I set aside some hours because the time just passes fast. I recommend everybody stay tuned. He's going to be talking about the evidence and the mindset of people in government. It's always important to understand the people you're trying to reach out to. That's why he's the guest today. So stay tuned. I'll be playing that very soon. But first of all, thank you so much to John Michael Talbot for doing a show for me last week. I know it's hard the first time you get on the mic and do something like this, but he did a good job, good interview with Ziggy Zugum last week, so you can hear that in the archives at 911freefall.com. I am back now. I took a week off to decompress and quietly celebrate reaching the midpoint of my 30s. And of course, the rule of the universe is that whenever you take a week off from something, everything and anything is going to happen in your absence. So I got some catching up to do here in this opening news segment. And the first bit of news is this. I didn't find out about it till the next morning because I didn't watch the Super Bowl. But apparently, We Are Change activist Matthew Mills did something that most activists have only talked about in hypotheticals up until then, usually starting with the words, "Wouldn't it be awesome if..." All right, during the post-game press conference with Super Bowl MVP Malcolm Smith, Matthew Mills, he had snuck into the stadium using a pass card that he got from working at another event in the past there at that stadium, and allegedly he did some kind of Jedi mind tricks when the pass didn't scan, telling the security guards there that he was running late and they let him get through. Well, he ran up and grabbed the microphone right during that press conference and said, "Investigate 9/11. 9/11 was perpetrated by people in our own government." And it got on ESPN, and the world press picked it up. I even had a friend from Brazil send me an article about it that was written in Portuguese. And Mills was arrested for trespassing. I'm not sure what the penalty was. I can't imagine it was that harsh, though. And I'll tell you what, folks. Usually Super Bowl ads cost millions of dollars, but Mills managed to get one for 9/11 Truth for just a fraction of that cost. Basically just the cost of his fine, whatever that was. So there you are. Anyone who's ever mused about the idea of interrupting the Super Bowl with a 9/11 Truth message pretty much got close to that this year. Mills gets the double cannonball award of 2014 for bravery in the field, at least for me. And at least for a little while, the world buzzes about it. In other news, the high-rise safety initiative is underway in New York City. The NYC CAN group, that's the group that tried to get New York City to launch its own independent investigation of 9/11 a few years back. This has this new initiative that's going to, and I'm going to quote it from 9/11 Blogger, amend the New York City Charter to require the New York City Department of Buildings to investigate all high-rise building collapses occurring in New York City on or after September 11th, 2001, except the collapse of World Trade Centers 1 and 2. The initiative will apply to the collapse of World Trade Center 7 on September 11th, 2001, as well as any high-rise collapse that occurs in the future. Now that is a brilliant idea. It excludes Towers 1 and 2. It just focuses on Building 7, and it appeals to the rationality of simply investigating why that building came down completely, allegedly because of fire, when no steel frame high-rise has ever done so because of fire before. And New York City has an interest in doing this, folks. I mean, it's a city full of high-rises, all right? You don't have fires breaking out and bringing them down like Building 7 came down. I mean, that would be a real mess and a real safety hazard to all those folks who work in those high-rises. Ted Walter, he's been a guest on this show before to talk about the Rethink 9/11 campaign. Well, he's one of the folks involved with this new New York City high-rise initiative campaign, so maybe I can get him back on the show to talk about that in more detail. But in the meantime, go to highrisesafetynyc.org to learn more about it. And I love the tagline at the top of the website. It says, "New Yorkers deserve answers when a building collapses. Our safety depends on it." And man, they are not kidding, folks. So again, that's highrisesafetynyc.org. All right, for the next bit of news, I'm going to play a clip for you from Washington Journal, February the 9th of this year. The caller is myself, though I use an alias. The guest is former Homeland Security Director under Bush, Tom Ridge.
And potential action, not in those individual countries, but more globally.
Let's go to Kyle joining us from Alder Creek, New York, Republican line with former Secretary Tom Ridge. Good morning.
Hi, thank you. Good morning. Thanks for letting me join the conversation. And before I go on, I want to just hope that, Steve, you live up to the ideals of your Fitzwater Award and let me get my question out. Mr. Ridge, several tons of small spheres of previously molten iron were found in the dust of the World Trade Center. And this is extremely significant because it appears there were thousands of structural steel cutter charges going off under explosive pressure, which would cause the molten iron to form droplets like rain. As well, red-gray incendiary chips were found in the dust by independent scientists. They had the same composition of thermite. And so my question is, what rational basis did federal investigators have for failing to test their World Trade Center dust samples for the presence of incendiaries or explosives even in the years after 9/11?
Well, my sense is that, number one, the answer would be within the federal government, within my scope of knowledge or experience. But if there's some kind of notion that there was a conspiracy that somehow that there were predetermined or preset charges that somehow facilitated destruction of the Twin Towers, I guess I would reject that completely.
Our guest is Tom Ridge, the former Pennsylvania.
So you heard it there, folks. Tom Ridge, of course, doesn't really address the question. I didn't exactly understand the first part of his answer either. I still don't. It sounded like he said it was within his sphere of knowledge, or did he say it wasn't? I don't know, but regardless, he goes on to say about the controlled demolition that he rejects that. Well, I mean, he can reject it all he wants. It doesn't make it go away, though, folks. All right? I mean, I can reject the notion that the Earth revolves around the sun. I can reject it all day and all night. Doesn't change the facts. And, of course, Steve Scully is not going to press him on that. That's not what he's there for. He's not a real journalist. And I did invoke his Fitzwater Award. This was an award that he won, I think, like in 2009, supposedly for unbiased journalism. And C-SPAN seems to get a pass, and they seem to get all of this esteem for being so unbiased because they don't take a side in the phony debate between Republican and Democrat, conservative and liberal, that divides the other networks on the cable news. That by being like the news of, 20 years ago, they somehow seem as this great bastion of journalism. But try to step out of that box. Try to talk about physics and common sense. And you get to see how unbiased they are. Now, things are getting better, but it's only because people push back. People aren't quitting. People keep bringing it up. People won't back down. And that's what you can't do, folks. You got to be assertive, especially with something as dire and drastic as this issue. Especially with people in power. They only respond when they are afraid of something. And I'm not saying threaten their lives or threaten violence or anything like that. That's not going to get us anywhere. And that's a last resort. That's when your back is against the wall and you have no other option in order to defend your life. And all the old tricks are not working anymore. The phony outrage, the invoking fear, the repetition to try to push a message. Tom Price does this in the latest compilation video of C-SPAN calls where he says, this is a dangerous world. We can't forget this is a dangerous world. Because they want to put that idea in your head. It's like an advertising message. Don't forget, be afraid. Don't listen to the people talking about science. Don't listen to rationality. Don't listen to your own inner voice. Listen to me, be afraid. It's a dangerous world. We are going to protect you. Just turn off your brains. Well, you can't do that, folks. You got to keep your brains functioning. You got to keep your mind in the physical world. All right? You got to keep it. I mean, you got to listen to yourself. And that is the most important thing that anybody can learn in this lifetime. And maybe every generation has to learn this lesson in their own way. You know, maybe during the 60s, somebody fighting in the civil rights movement had to learn this lesson. Maybe during the Revolutionary War, some soldier out there in the field fighting the redcoats had to learn this lesson. Maybe abolitionists in the time before the Civil War. Regardless, in our generation, right now, in our time in history, we have to learn to listen to ourselves, to not listen to the masters or the self-proclaimed masters. I don't even give them that much credit anymore. I don't give them that much esteem. I don't respect them. And you can't. You respect their humanity. You understand that they are victims in many ways of this post-9/11 world as well. But you don't respect these titles. You don't respect these artificially created levels of esteem that they think they themselves are entitled to just because they hold a certain position. Because if they're not living up to the ideals of that position, then it doesn't matter what they call themselves. They don't deserve your respect. And people will respect somebody who knows what they're talking about and tells the truth and has conviction. That's what impresses people. That's what reaches people. Not all the other phony stuff. And I think we're learning that. I think a lot of people are coming to that conclusion now. It's part of this great awakening. So, with that said, we're going to do what we do every week. We're going to take 10 seconds of silence to remember the victims of 9/11 and their families and all the people who died in the wars that followed 9/11. We're going to do that starting now. And that is 10 seconds. In the following interview with John O'Malley, we talk about the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence and his perspective as a former government employee at the Pentagon. Occasionally, the conversation goes into some other areas that are not related to 9/11 truth. So let me restate this week, as I always do, that the opinions expressed by the guests and occasionally by myself on the show do not reflect the opinions of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth just focuses on the controlled demolitions of the buildings in New York on 9/11 and has no position on other topics outside of that mission.
John O'Malley is a retired federal government employee who lives in suburban Washington, D.C. His career was in science and technology, and he'll be talking more about that in this interview. John, welcome to 9/11 Freefall.
Thank you.
Now, for our audience, I talk a lot, or I talked a little bit about you in the intro to this show, but I want them to get an idea of who you are, your background, where you're coming from as you approach this important issue of 9/11 Truth and the scientific evidence of what really happened on that day. So tell us more about your background.
Well, I worked in aerospace. I worked with aircraft turbine engines. I worked with aircraft structures and aerodynamics. I worked in the Pentagon close to where we were told a Boeing 757 crashed, and I never thought I would see this happening in my country. Most of my time was spent in defense, and worked on the turbine engines because most defense aircraft are used turbine engines, and some of the aircraft that I was involved with in varying degrees would be C-17, that's a cargo, the UH-60 Black Hawk, the Chinook CH-47, that's the big tandem rotor troop carrier, the Osprey, which is that's a Marine Corps aircraft that is a tilt rotor, where it has tandem rotors side by side, so that but they tilt, so it can take off like a helicopter, but then the rotors or the blades tilt, so it can fly faster than a helicopter. One of the problems with a helicopter that limits the speed is the advancing blade tip speed. As a helicopter goes faster, the tip of the advancing blade starts to get into the something closer to the transonic or supersonic air range, and that is a limiting factor in the speed of helicopters. So that's why they tried to and did develop the Osprey so that they could go faster, because if someone's shooting at you, you want to be able to go as fast as possible. It helps your survivability.
Right, and it's so interesting to listen to you talk about this, and it's fascinating the amount of thought and basically creation, just creative efforts that goes into making some of these weapon systems, making the airplanes, and I'm always for a strong defense. Of course, I'm not for what's been going on in the years following 9/11, which we'll be getting into in just a minute. But I want our audience to focus in on the fact that, you were a person in our government working for Pentagon, and you had a tremendous amount of responsibility, an awful lot of people relying on you. So you're a very well-qualified, very well-educated individual who has seen a lot in your career and has a vested interest in seeing this country, if for no other reason than the pride that you take in your work and the patriotism that you accumulate throughout your life, working for the United States government. You have a vested interest in seeing that things turn out right, not just, for the immediate present, but for the future, for future generations, the country that you work so hard for. So, moving on from that and from your illustrious background and what you did, let's get to 9/11. And you mentioned earlier, you can't believe you're seeing this happen to your country. I think that's the sentiment a lot of people express in one way or another as they begin to wake up to the reality of the situation we're facing and what really happened on that day 12 years ago now. So, tell us about your awakening. Tell us how you woke up to the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence, and then what prompted you to start speaking out and taking action?
Well, the thing that woke me up, and I've noticed, I've talked to a lot of people, and it seems like different things wake up different people. So I'm just going to tell you what woke me up. I follow the weather. The weather is important to me. And there's this guy, Piers Corbyn, in the UK, who has a very good track record of weather prediction. And so I had a Google alert for him. And I listened to him being interviewed by this guy named Alex Jones. And I had never heard of Alex Jones. And at the end of the interview, this was right after Donald Trump had raised the fuss, and they put the president's birth certificate PDF on whitehouse.gov, and Alex said that he just looked at it, and that he said not only was it a phony, it was not even a very good forgery. And I said, oh, come on, that can't be true. That would never happen. But just out of curiosity, I went to whitehouse.gov, and I downloaded it to my computer, and I looked at it, and I was flabbergasted. Now, I'm not an Adobe expert. I used to teach classes in Adobe, but I was flabbergasted that it had evidence of copying and pasting. It was not a clean scan of a paper document. Now, I used to do this stuff at one time for a little while. I was a webmaster on a government website, and I used to do this. I would take pieces of paper, scan them, put them on the server, create a hyperlink, and then whoever went to the website could get a copy of it and download it and print it. So I said, man, just wait till the Washington Post gets a hold of this. Jay Leno is going to have a field day. And that's what I expected. And the silence was deafening. And that was my first real indication that we have a controlled press. We do not have a free press. That there must be some organization, and I'm not the only one who's figured this out. Millions of Americans are figuring this out. And once I looked at that, I started to look at other things like the JFK murder, Oklahoma City, 9/11, and they all have these problems. And the one thing I noticed, and other people have noticed this, is that all of these operations like 911, et cetera, have the same common multiple modus operandi, in that there's indications that some people had foreknowledge of the operation, the use of drills and exercises to provide cover for the operation. They have an official story that does not make sense or even violates the laws of physics. Very often you have disabled or seized video cameras or altered video. There's an immediate and hasty destruction of the evidence. And there's secrecy surrounding the official investigation that indicates they're trying to hide something. And then you have an immediate disinformation campaign to plant the official story in the public mind, because ideas have stickiness. When a person gets an idea, it's difficult for them to change their mind. Then you have a multi-year, well-funded disinformation campaign to keep the public believing the official lie. You have the use of ridicule in the media to personally attack anyone who questions the official lie. You have suspicious deaths of witnesses. And then you have the use of distraction to divert the public's attention away from the real story. Well, this is not the country I thought I was living in. I grew up believing and being told that we had a free press. So, this is why a lot of people, literally millions of people, believe that all these things seem to be a part of a larger agenda or something. We really don't know what's happening, but once you realize that we do not have a free press, that we have a controlled press, now you really don't know what to believe. It makes life more difficult because you have to question everything that you hear.
Right, I agree with you completely, and with the press especially. I consider that my biggest adversary for me personally in the mission I've taken on is to overcome that media, because it is so blatant. It's basically, I've said the line before so many times on the show, is that, and not just with C-SPAN, even though I've used it in context of describing Washington Journal in the morning, but really the whole quote-unquote mainstream, but not really mainstream anymore, media is just this. It's customer service for whatever, the empire, however you want to define it, the establishment, the machine. But it's a way of making the American people feel like they have some real kind of opinion, or that they're really being informed, when really, as long as you stay within the box that they've crafted for you, you're okay. It's like being the class president. You can talk about what colors you want for prom, or what kind of punch you want to serve, and at the next dance. But you can't say there's not going to be any homework. You can't say that we're going to have Fridays off from now on. These are the kinds of things that the American people are not allowed to really raise their voices about, or if they do, they just get ignored. And it's not. And the matters that are affecting our country right now are not as trivial as not having homework or having Fridays off. There are issues of life or death for our country, war, the evisceration of our rights, and of course the most important thing, which all these things are based on, which we talk about every week on the show, which is 9/11, and this obvious fact that these buildings were brought down in a controlled demolition. You don't even need a scientific background to recognize that. All you have to do is just use your own brain, use your own common sense, and do your own thinking, and just watch, especially with Building 7, just watch that building come down, look at some of the evidence, and you realize that. And when people try to bring this evidence to the media, when they try to bring it to the general public, they see the media serving to deflect, using the same kind of diversionary tactics that a lot of customer service reps do when you call in to complain about a certain product or service that a company is offering. And I know, I recognize some of these things, so they used to do it. It's happening on a larger scale. And it is a scary feeling, and you begin to, you look at it in a certain way, as to say, well, is this something that's just developing now? But as you start to study more about history, you realize that the more things change, the more they stay the same. You see these same patterns throughout history, and the media serving as this kind of customer service wing, but it seems to be increasing. I don't know, what do you think about that? Do you think that it's been heightened since 9/11, or do you think it's kind of always been that way?
They seem to be accelerating. And there seems to be something going on like every 4.5, 5, 6 months. And once you do a thorough study of all of the smoking guns on 9/11, and now you have a situation where literally millions of Americans are of the opinion that the war on terror is really a war against us. Now that sounds so crazy that I did not want to believe it. I mean, the thing that really, turned me around was me trying to figure out, is there any way that I could explain Building 7 that would make sense? There's no way you can, and there's only one obvious answer that I know of, and that is pre-planted explosive charges placed and detonated by a team of experts. Now, because I worked in the Pentagon where the plane hit, or whatever it was hit, if I had been there that day, I probably would not be talking to you right now. So I follow the news about 9/11, and I do not live under a rock. I'm a consumer of news. It was years after 9/11 before I even heard of Building 7. So they were that good at censoring out any mention of Building 7 in all of these huge news organizations like CNN, Fox, ABC, Washington Post, Washington Times, New York Times. You would think that at least a few of them would have had major stories about a 47-story building collapsing in 7 seconds in the middle of Manhattan that was not hit by a plane. It really it's amazing. It's something I never thought that I would be seeing happening in this country.
I have my own theory on some of that. Some people will say that it's a giant conspiracy and everybody's in lockstep. I see reporters more as human, and I think a lot of people on the date. Like, for instance, I watched Building 7 fall as it happened. I thought it was a controlled demolition that they did to control the fire. It didn't make any sense. I wasn't thinking that it didn't make any sense. I was just kind of caught up in the excitement of the day. And, moving on because the TV was telling me to, just as was everybody else. And even though the internet existed, we did not have the kind of user-created content sites that we do now in terms of, like, the popularity, like YouTube as an example of that. So there weren't people, I'm not saying there weren't any, but in the large amounts, you didn't have as many people awakened to this kind of thing and people catching these things as they happen. So a lot of the public just kind of moved along that day. And whereas they weren't looking at Building 7 as a significant event on that day because it was dwarfed by the obvious just total destruction of the Twin Towers that happened earlier, and the dramatic and scary event that had taken place, and seeing those planes crash into those buildings, they moved on. And so when it came to discussing it years later, when most people started hearing about it, the machine, establishment, empire, whatever you want to call it, had already put that label of conspiracy theory on it, had already attached that moniker to it, that anybody who talks about it has got something wrong with them. And then people just go to that default position. And this is the problem. And you see this a lot with politicians and even media people who get questioned about this. They'll give some ridiculous, just speculative answer. Well, maybe there were construction problems with it. Well, you don't know. I mean, you're just throwing that out there. You're just making up something on the spot. But the people listening automatically want to believe the official story. They want to defer to that. So they'll seize on anything, even if it doesn't make any sense in this universe, to try to defend the official story and write it off. And I see it as a huge psychological problem as much as a open censorship problem. I'm not saying there aren't people out there who openly censor this stuff, but to say it's an interesting phenomenon is an understatement. I've said it so many times on this show. There are going to be volumes written about the psychology of this country at this time in history, and how this public turned a blind eye, at least for these 12 years, to these obvious issues with the official story, and of course the science, which doesn't change just because 9/11 is happening. So that's my comment on that. But we talked about the psychology, and you touched upon this, and obviously this was a huge thing for you to wake up to. I mean, speaking for yourself, and then kind of stepping back also, and just talking about government workers in general, people who have had a vested interest in the system, have had their careers tied into it. What goes on? And I know you can't speak for everybody, but what goes on in a person's brain, especially at that level, as you start to wake up to this? What makes some people accept it and other people reject it, in your opinion?
Yeah. Before I say that, just if I could mention, back when you were talking about the press, I think it is possible to be a part of a conspiracy without knowing about the conspiracy. I think some of that is happening. That was just a comment about the press. I would say the most people in government work in government because a lot of them, they grew up in a company town, and when you grew up in a company town, you work for the company or you don't work. If they had grown up in Detroit, they'd be working for Ford or GM. So that's really why they basically need a job, because they have to pay the rent or the car payment or whatever. Now, I would say that the thing that has convinced most people that I've talked to has been Building 7, because that's the biggest smoking gun. And I didn't want to believe it. I mean, before I looked or examined the evidence, I thought the 9/11 truthers were a bunch of nuts. I just didn't think it would be possible for the government to do this as a part of a false flag and get away with it, and killing 3,000 Americans. It's like, oh my God. But the physics is there. Now, a lot of people, including myself, were resistant to believing this because, I guess you could say maybe three reasons. The first would be, how in the world could you find enough Americans who would do such a thing? I mean, I've worked with many people, and I don't think I've ever worked with anyone who would do such a thing. So that makes it difficult to believe. The second one is, how could you keep it a secret? That there would be too many whistleblowers. And then the third one is, I thought that the free press would inform us of what happened. Now, there is, if you work in detective work or in military intelligence, and I actually did work in military intelligence for a little while, and you get a lot of clues or a lot of anecdotal evidence, and much of which is unconnected, and you're trying to make sense of it. And you can come up with a lot of possible hypotheses, a lot of possible theories. Well, if you can take some of those theories and figure out that they are impossible, then you can eliminate those theories. And now you can go to the other theories, which even though they are difficult to believe, they are not impossible. When I say impossible, I mean physically impossible. The official story is physically impossible. It violates the laws of physics, and you can look at the pictures, at the video of Building 7, 9/11, the pictures at the Pentagon, and you can see it's not possible. So now you have to look at other theories, which, even though they may be difficult to believe, they are not actually impossible. And then you start to look at these things, and like the whistleblowers, well, you've got a 2-star general, Major General Albert Stubblepine, former head of U.S. Army Intelligence, who's on YouTube. He's a whistleblower. When you go on the Internet, there's whistleblowers all over the place. Now, in all of these big media outlets like, CNN, Fox, etc., you will never see any mention that a 2-star Army general is a 9/11 truther. Well, there's where you get into control of the information that the public receives, and that's really the big deal. In fact, as horrifying as 9/11 was, the fact that we do not have a free press really may be even more serious, because if they would lie to us about something like 9/11, well, what else are they lying to us about? And like with me, I said to myself, well, now, if I was wrong about 9/11, what other things am I wrong about, because I was a consumer of a controlled media that was giving me disinformation? So it's hard to believe both the depth and the breadth of the corruption in our controlled press and media. But once you start to look at this stuff and examine it, you can see that it is that. And this goes back to the murder of JFK. I see the same thing. So I think a lot of people do not want to believe it because it is so horrifying. But then once they actually look at the evidence, and they say they say those 3 little words, "Oh my God," it is like walking through a one-way door. You will never go back. Well, the number of Americans who've walked through that one-way door is getting pretty large.
And I think this is all, the symptoms of what we call the post-9/11 world, and it's a second wave of horror after the initial event, of watching our press just completely melt down. And it's almost like I compare it to Terminator, where the skin falls away off the android, and you just see this big metal skeleton coming after you. That's kind of what the press has become, because the facade is falling. People see it. People see it for the ugly metal skeleton with the glowing red eyes underneath for what it is, and now you're stuck with it, though. At least for the time being, because this is like your form of news. It's like living in an occupied country. And I always got to laugh when these old action movies that involve some kind of a conspiracy where the main character, once he gets past the bad guys and gets the evidence to the news, it's all wrapped up and done because they're going to cover it, and it's the happy ending. I know real life does not work that way. People have tried to get the evidence to the media. C-SPAN gets Building 7 questions virtually every day, and they do everything they can not to address it, to just move on. And the only reason that they have had to address it is because they're getting them all the time. So the people have had to apply some verbal force and getting this issue to be addressed. And what is your response to those videos? I know you've seen some of them, politicians being questioned. I mean, how does that make you feel when you see congressmen? I mean, some of them have given some good answers, actually. But, I mean, for the greater majority, a lot of them just run from this issue. They're afraid. I mean, how much confidence does that give you in our legislature that even people who allegedly have quote-unquote power are dodging this, don't want to deal with it, don't even want to look at it when it's presented to them?
Well, when I've seen these things on C-SPAN, I think it's really sad. It is hard to tell if they are misinformed, as I was, or are they some conscious part of a very well-funded disinformation campaign. I don't know. It does not take much to figure out what happened to Building 7. All you have to do is to examine the evidence. You know, with our members of Congress, we really expect two things. We expect honesty and courage. And it will take those two things if we ever get an investigation of what really happened on 9/11. Some people, part of it may be the old thing about you can be a part of a conspiracy without even knowing about it. I think a lot of people have lost a lot of respect for C-SPAN. But their big problem is they are losing control over the media. All of these big media outlets like Fox, CNN, etc., are losing market share every year, while people like Alex Jones, their numbers are going up. Now, part of that may be that once people figure out that they're being lied to, then they stop tuning in, because it really, most people say it should not be too much to ask for a news organization to just give us the facts. And if a news organization is not doing that, then people will turn them off. And I think that's why a lot of these big outfits are have their ratings going down. CNN, Fox, the New York Times, the Washington Post, because if they won't talk about, if they won't correctly report something as important like 9/11, then what good are they? So I think that's part of what's going on here.
Right, and you got to look at what certain professions attract. And with the state of our media now, and so much fluff and so much infotainment taking over our ways that we used to gather news, I mean, it's not really attracting the budding Walter Cronkites of the world, the Edward R. Murrows of the world. What it's attracting are people who basically want to be famous. And I'm not saying there aren't good journalists somewhere out there. You can't obviously speak for every single person, when but overall, just from what I've seen, just what I perceive from the folks that you see on the television and you read in the newspapers, it's people who want to get their name out there, who want to make a career for themselves. And basically, with the way that the journalism is being set up, the way that it manifested itself in this new century, especially after 9/11, it's not good for one's career if you want to go that route to talk about this stuff. I mean, it's great for you to get viewers and listeners, but the machine will spit you out if you do that. I mean, and so, people will respect you, but you're not going to be on the television necessarily. You're not going to be have your face on buses and billboards anymore. And that, because of the way we're brought up and thinking that fame and money is everything, the people that get attracted into those kind of positions are basically going to sell out. They've made that decision and they're fine with it. And I'm sorry if anybody from the mainstream media is listening and you're getting your feelings hurt, but this is what I perceive. Prove me wrong and cover Building 7, please. But this is the situation, and you see this with controlling entities, controlling organizations love to attract these kinds of people, and they attract the people who are willing to toe the company line, and those are the people that get ahead in the machines, in the big corporate machine of news that we see today. Now, obviously there's what you see publicly in the public conversations. What do you think? And I know this is kind of speculative, but just from your own experience, what kind of conversations do you think go on behind the scenes? I mean, have you heard people talk about, and don't give any specific names or out any specific people, but do people around you talk about this more openly, quietly, when there's no cameras rolling, when the doors are closed?
Well, before that, let me just make one comment on the people on the TV news shows. What I and other people have noticed is that these people on the news seem to have an envelope in which they can operate. And as soon as they get close to the edge of that envelope or go over it, all of a sudden you don't see them anymore. You do not see any notice that they were fired or quit. They just disappear. So the people who are the puppet masters are people that we probably don't even know. I mean, they're up at the, they're the managers in these big news organizations. Now, to go to your next question, there's a lot of people in the government who know all about Building 7, and they believe that 9/11 was a false flag in order to get us into Iraq and Afghanistan because of the oil. And some of them suspect that there's an even darker agenda to disable the Constitution and move us into some type of a world government with a one world currency, and of course that's conjecture. But the people in government who, at the working level, they have an idea of what is going on, but they do not have any more ability to control it than you or I do, because the control freaks are at the very top of the government. So people talk to one another. People go out to lunch. There's a lot of people in the government who have technical backgrounds, and that's just because of the nature of a lot of the work in the government. And if you have any technical background at all in engineering or science, it's very easy to see what happened to Building 7. I mean, this is high school physics. And now people who believe that and who talk that may have a tendency to talk outside the workplace during non-duty hours. And this is where you start to, wonder, why do the crooks want to have a searchable database of everybody's emails and text messages? Well, we don't know, but the emails that they want to know about are the emails that are going from one American to another. So I think that there's a lot of talk between people, but you won't see that presented at the official level, because remember, the top of the government, all of them are either politicians or they are political appointees. And these people will not even talk about it. I mean, if you get them on C-SPAN and they're asked a question, they basically play dumb. And I don't think they're that dumb. Maybe they are. I don't know.
Right, and also, too, to even get to where they are, they got to go through a political party system, too, where there's like a party keeping them in line, telling them what to say, what to do, don't say this, don't say that, say this, say that. And, there's usually somebody in the party setting an agenda. that they're following. So it's like they're walking in lockstep. And basically, it seems like they're just following orders, a lot of them from even the higher power. So it's almost like everybody's just kind of standing around following orders from somebody. And, I don't speculate on this show on who it is, but it just seems like that everybody just passes the buck. You see that outside when Austin Farwell was doing his outreach outside the New York Times, and a reporter tells him, I don't make these decisions, I'm just a reporter, something to that effect. And then the politicians kind of pass the buck, too, once they go to the proper authorities. And the proper authorities, allegedly the FBI, they just stonewall. I just questioned Tom Ridge on Sunday about laying out some very specific points about the previously molten iron in the dust of the World Trade Center, and all he said on it was, I reject that. Well, he can reject it all he wants. It doesn't change the fact. I can reject the fact the sky is blue when the sun's shining, but it doesn't change the fact that it is. So, this is what they do. This is what we're dealing with now. And, I think it's very important that people are having these private conversations, but the first thing to do is stop talking about it so quietly. I talk about it out loud even when it makes people nervous or uncomfortable. It doesn't matter, because the more you show that you're willing to speak out, the more it emboldens others to come out and do it, too. And, you got to be the one who's willing to set that example for other people, because, to face it, folks, the person looking back at you in the mirror right now is the only one that is going to change things, and you got to accept that responsibility. And I want to get, your take on it. If you could speak to somebody right now who may be in a position like you had about this issue and why it's important to speak out, than worrying about perception and mass peer pressure, what would you say to him, John?
Well, I would say the big problem is the controlled press, and you have to get around the controlled press. You have to bypass the controlled press, and that is what people are doing. Some guy goes to college, and people in the dorm look at things like loose change or experts speak out, and then they come home and they talk to their parents. And the Internet is making it possible to send links with these YouTubes to things like, In Plain Sight and Loose Change and Experts Speak Out and, the Architects and Engineers website. So that's one way of bypassing the controlled press. The other thing is a lot of people don't want to believe it because it's just so horrifying. They don't want to believe it. And the one thing that I've noticed that will help convince some people is remind them of what happened with the JFK murder, the Gulf of Tonkin. You see that this is not new. This stuff has been going on for a long time. And another problem we have is, now those of us from backgrounds in science and technology can sometimes have a difficult time explaining things to the vast majority of the population who do not have a technical background. And I think when we explain this to people, we have to do it in such a way that they can relate to it. For example, with the Twin Towers, we can tell them that a hydrocarbon fire cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but that won't convince them. But then if you tell them why, that the reason that it can is a hydrocarbon fire has to have a continual flow of oxygen because it's dependent on the oxygen. And this continual flow of colder air has a cooling effect. So when you have a charcoal grill, it doesn't get hot enough to melt the grill and collapse the grill because cooler air is continually feeding that fire. And then as the cooler air comes in, the hot air is leaving. And if a hydrocarbon fire could burn hot enough to melt steel, every charcoal grill would have a big warning label on it that would say something like, warning, do not put too much lighter fluid in this charcoal grill, otherwise the grill will melt and collapse. Well, that's something people can kind of understand, that they can understand that, well, it gets hot enough to cook a hamburger, but it doesn't get hot enough to melt steel. In order to melt steel, you have to have something like thermite, because with thermite, the oxygen is actually in the thermite itself. It's a metallic oxide, so it doesn't depend on that flow of air. And the other thing, the flow of air slows the rate of combustion, because the rate of combustion is dependent on the airflow. Just like if you have a charcoal grill or a wood stove, you control the flow of air. And this thermite, on the other hand, all the oxygen is right there, so the combustion happens all at once. So people in the fields of science and technology need to kind of communicate in a way that, non-technical people can understand and, look at these things that don't make sense. So we have to kind of communicate these technical facts to non-technical people in a way that the non-technical people can understand. Now, one guy, I think David Chandler, he seems to be good at this, because I think he was a high school teacher. And I've noticed that people who teach school, like college professors, tend to be very good at explaining things verbally, because that's what they do all day. So, right. And then I think we have to become involved in the political process. We have to join the local Democratic club, the local Republican club. We have to talk to politically active people. I mean, convincing one politically active person, I think, is worth more than convincing 1,000 people who are not politically active. I mean, half of the country does not even vote. The other half, all they do is vote. And only a tiny percentage of the population are politically active. The rest, they just go home and watch TV. So, if in a democracy there is a penalty for not being involved in the political process. So we have to become more politically active. We have to go to, meetings or whatever where we will meet politically active people, and we have to become precinct chairman or join the local whatever it is, because if we just talk to one another, that's not going to do a whole lot. You are not going to make many converts by preaching to the choir. You have to go out and preach to the heathen, and you have to communicate it to them in such a way that they don't think you're crazy, because what we're saying is so unbelievable that people may think you're crazy. So I think that's what we have to do. I think that's the only way to do it. I mean, the only way we will get a real investigation is through a congressional vote. And that's going to be done by politically active people. That is the only way it's going to happen.
Amen, man. John O'Malley, thanks for coming on 9/11 Pre-Fall.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for listening. Remember, you can hear this program every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific. You can also download it at 911freefall.com. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week and good luck.